So these are the two items that I'm focusing on the contents of the daily Boris graph on page 13. The first one is the item about the Supreme Court ruling. Now, it doesn't say what date the Supreme Court ruled on this one about this woman called Zamira Hajieba, who is an Azerbaijani woman who is the wife of an Azerbaijani banker. And the Azerbaijani banker, according to this report, was sentenced to 15 years in jail in Azerbaijan for defrauding the bank out of 2.2 billion pounds. And this woman is his wife, who the Azerbaijani government wanted to extradite back to Azerbaijan. But the chief magistrate, who is named as Emma Arbuthnot, ruled that Zamira Hajieba would not be able to get a fair trial if she were to be extradited to Azerbaijan, because she is wanted in Azerbaijan over fraud, organized crime worth about 70 million pounds. So whatever the details of the reasoning that the chief magistrate allegedly used to refuse the application of the Azerbaijanis to extradite Zamira Hajieva back to Azerbaijan is not mentioned in the report in the Boris graph today. But what it outlines, what it actually illustrates, is the fact of the wealthy foreign persons, mainly foreign criminals, and people with dubious sources of income or no source of income, but in possession of huge sums of money. Now, this Zamira Hajieba was known as a criminal to the UK Home Office back in 2006, when she was allowed to settle in the UK on condition that she would make investment. So they didn't actually say whether she was honest and she had legitimate, demonstrable sources of income for her wealth. All the British Home Office was interested in, or the British state was interested in, was whether she would spend money. So she was welcomed to settle in Britain, despite the fact that it was not clear where she got the money. The condition on which she was allowed to stay and settle down in Britain was that she would spend the money, wherever the money came from. So in effect, the British Home Office, on that occasion, on the occasion of Zamira Hajieba being given the settled status, was operating an organized criminal activity operation. Let that sink in. And If this case is on the evidence, on the pattern of the evidence, is multiplied by whatever numbers of criminals, foreign criminals with huge sums of money, unexplained sums of money, wanted to settle in Britain, then it would be exactly the kind of thing that Supreme Court President, who retired in 2017, said in 2017 that after Brexit, London would become attractive to emerging foreign kind of legal litigation. Neuberger never meant litigation for fair trial or fair litigation or for fairness. What Neuberger was saying and what we have interpreted him as actually meaning was that Britain could become an even more of an offshore kind of location for laundering huge sums of money by criminals who would be allowed to use the British judicial system or bureaucracy to launder the money. And Zamira Hajieva, the Azerbaijanian criminal, was exactly fitting the bill. Although the dates of Neuberger's utterance in January 2017 and the various dates involved with Zamira Hajieva's various kind of activities as recorded were distant from one another, but the principle of unprincipled legal kind of prostitution of the legal system in the UK was very much clear. There is a news item immediately underneath that one, which refers to Winston Churchill's Marrakesh painting being put on sale on the auction house, and it's estimated to be worth about £300,000. Now, if you extrapolate, multiply, and use those kind of Corson artifacts, original artifacts, and apply those to the items of the Kitten's house that were targeted for criminal damage and kind of criminal removal by the gangs of criminals, including the London Borough of Trahammers Council and the Spitalfields Small Business Association and their co-criminals in 2012. The costs based on this estimated value of Winston Churchill's Marrakesh painting, one painting, the value would be several billion pounds. And so we have said that the criminality created, the criminal atmosphere created by the London Borough of Trahammers Council included the perpetuation of a 24/7 uncertain atmosphere. And this included the use or the deployment or the unleashing of gangs of racists harassing targeted persons at targeted addresses. And this particular item or this particular category of criminality, the Tower Hamlets Council unleashed and perpetuated, let's say during the 1970s, included the criminal collusion by the what was then the West Stepney Law Center, which ceased to exist. But a criminal involved in the West Stepney Law Center as a solicitor was called Roy Minkoff. Now, Minkoff is a not Gibraltarian, it's a name from a Mediterranean island. And Roy Minkoff is, as far as we know at this date, Monday the 21st of December 2020, still installed at the National Union of Journalists, their so-called in-house solicitor. And Minkoff was typical licensed law trader, completely devoid of all the kind of duties that he owed to the people seeking the help of the West Stepney Law Center, and the damages that were being done by the racists during the 1970s, of which Roy Minkoff was made aware. Minkoff is a Maltese name, and Minkoff lied through his teeth, and as he failed to make the case against the racists and the racist harassers, and the complicity by the Tower Hamlets Local Council, Tower Hamlets Borough Council, with the racists harassing the particular targeted person or persons. And the main agenda of the harassment or the harassers, with the knowledge and complicit knowledge of the London Borough of Tower Hamlets Council, the local council, was to make life completely uncertain for the target. And so therefore, this breached not one, but dozens of legal duties that even in the 70s, the Tower Hamlets, as local council, was under. Duties that the council owed to the target or targets of the harassments. And all the evidence of the actual physical targeting, all the evidence was made known to the London Borough of Tower Hamlets Council, to the Metropolitan Police, and to Roy Minkoff at the so-called West Stepney Law Center. In Tower Hamlets, there is no active law center at the present time. There has never been. What there has been is a pretense law center. Most of the law centers are either directly affiliated to the political party or parties, or they are affiliated with the gangs of criminals, antisocial elements operating in the local area through the council, being council employees or being council elected councillors. So what happened with the harassment and uncertainty was that ordinary living was made impossible, ordinary sleeping was made impossible, ordinary taking of rest was made impossible, ordinary work was made impossible. So if you multiply the interruptions, the uncertainties, the moments of kind of panic attacks that affected the victims and targets of the harassment, and you can see the numbers of incidents running into thousands every single month. And so this was going on in the 70s. And this continued to go on in the 80s, in the 90s, in the 200s. And now, 2020, it has been going on. But the locations have changed, and the direct result of the harassment and uncertainty and the evictions that were kind of applied against the target of the, or targets of the attacks by the racists and the criminals operating under the cover of the local Towners Council or under the covers of other organizations. In this context, the Spitalfield Small Business Association. Now, as we said in previous posts, the Spitalfield Small Business Association was itself created in the 1980s to serve as a source of income for the then recently formed Spitalfields Housing Co-op. And the housing co-op, although there had been long campaign for a housing co-op or the creation of a legally kind of usable platform to campaign for the housing needs of the community to be met, mainly the Bangladeshis in the context of Tower Hamders. As soon as the cooperative got going, it became clear that it became a vehicle for persons from the community who were members of the local Labour Party and who were not actually interested in delivering the promised housing rights services, which were the main aims and objects behind the campaign to set up this Spitalfield Housing Co-op with the help of the then still active Greater London Council. And the Spitalfields Housing Cooperative resulted, is one of the results of the campaign against racism that got a particular kind of trigger and a particular momentum and a particular kind of appeal in the public opinion after the murder by the racists of Altawali in May 1978 and in July, the murder of the other Bangladeshi man that was murdered by racists in the same kind of year. So Spitalfield Housing Co-op was one. And of course, the campaign for educational rights was another, the Benth organization. And my appearance at the then Inner London Education Authority as one of the two community elected representatives to sit on the Inner London Education Authority from Tower Hamlets. Now, that was a forum that I had campaigned to have set up, not just myself, but I had campaigned with other people to have set up in the Inner London Education Authority to meet the very serious needs of the African and Asian communities in the Inner London Education Authority areas, that is 10 London boroughs. So the campaign against the racist attacks, the campaign connected with the campaign against racism got particular kind of traction when the community's position was explained in the wake of the racist murdering Al-Tabali. And Ishaq Ali, who was murdered in July in Hackney. Those are the two things that happened. The creation of the Spitalfields Housing Co-op and the creation of the Benth organization. Now, the Benth organization would have fizzled out without me. I gave it life and I gave it personality and I gave it substance. I did not take part in the management of the Spitalfields Housing Co-op because I didn't need to pursue a career. Those who jumped on the Spitalfields Housing Co-op management, that was in the 80s, in the beginning of the 80s, let's say. So beginning of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, 2000, now it's like 40 years now. 4 decades have passed since the Spitalfields Housing Co-op was established, and the establishment received money from the Greater London Council. And the reason why the Greater London Council supported this was the awareness that we created about housing being the most important, single most important issue that affected the issue of settlement and life of the Bangladeshis in the east end of London in Tower Hamlets. And the very aims of creating assured, settled, kind of certain environment for the Bangladeshis in Tower Hamlets in terms of housing. This then became, in effect, denied by the elements that jumped on the bandwagon and kind of created a complete diversion away from the aims and objects of the housing cooperative. And it became a clique. The Spitalfields Housing Cooperative, instead of being the vehicle for dynamic, ongoing campaigning service for housing, meeting the housing needs of the community, became a vehicle for corruption by the identifiable numbers of individuals that got hold of the control of the housing cooperative. And this became the pattern. This pattern of funded organizations being captured by criminals or captured by individuals that became then defiant in pursuing criminally personal, selfish, and corrupt aims for their own personal benefits, which emerged in the Benth organization, where the criminals ganged up over controlling the organization rather than delivering the educational advocacy and service and rights to the community. So it became a pattern. All the funded organizations funded on the evidence that the Bangladeshi part of the population in Tower Hamlets was physically deprived and needed all kinds of support to overcome the deprivation and to move on. And that is very much linked to the operation of racism, of course, on the one hand, and the overwhelming evidence that the majority of the Bangladeshis who arrived in the UK, mainly in the 1970s, the young children and their families, the majority of the Bangladeshis were, in terms of schooling and formal education, mostly without education, formal education that is. And so therefore they didn't kind of qualify for jobs and opportunities in terms of employment based on skills that could be referable or identifiable by reference to academic qualifications and certificates, which is what the Benth organization sold as a matter of kind of weeks by my formula that the Siloti language skills should be treated as a qualification. What this did was to disqualify, in effect, many of the otherwise qualified people that had formal qualification certificates. They were disqualified because of the failure in their skills to provide the service that the Siloti language community or Siloti speaking community needed very badly. This was not the only dichotomy that I had solved. I solved other dichotomies which shall be elaborated on later. But essentially, the foundation of the community's advocacy, which is involved in the movement defending the community in the East End of London, was uniquely created by me. And it wasn't thought about by anybody else decades earlier, and it is still decades later not being thought about by anybody, which makes it doubly, trebly significant and absolutely essential kind of evidence of the very serious work that I have been doing and the movement has been doing and the constituent campaigns like the Khoodeelaar campaign have been doing to meet, to fill the gaps that the status quo organization of the population and demography in an area like Tower Hamlets creates for people that come from areas or backgrounds like the Siloti speaking Bangladeshis. Now, decades later, it can be seen that in terms of technical numbers, there are several examples every kind of year of young persons growing up in this bara, in this country, but young persons who are children of Bangladeshis coming from Silot, attending schools and attending colleges and other institutions, and actually acquiring various academic certificates and qualifications. But they are not in the majority. They are in the minority. And the reason why they are in the minority is because the majority has been condemned to a future of crime and criminality and lack of skills and lack of competitive abilities that could actually see them compete successfully with the others from other backgrounds and other qualifications and other kind of ethnicities. For this reason, I maintain the campaign in demanding that Tower Hamlets Council provide the various support and services. So what I was doing and what I have been doing is the equivalent to running not one, not two, not three, not four, several kind of, if you like, campaigns, movements, organizations, bodies that would need each of them to be in any way effective, authentic, reliable. Each of them would need the expenditure every financial year of the full that is kind of enough to maintain the full-time equivalent, so at least 4 or 5 active persons on full pay. That is the amount of work that would have been needed, and that has been needed, and that is still needed. But none of the organizations that have been funded by the council is doing the work, number one. Number two, even if there were the intention funded organizations to do the work, they wouldn't have the know-how, they wouldn't have the skills. And so therefore, it is very important to understand the complexity of the explanation or the operation. I have been dealing with language and formal kind of academic schooling, as well as the very important social identity and solidarity that are absolutely essential if a community is to move ahead by being able to educate its young persons. Number one. Number two is the absence that persists in the Bangladeshi community in the UK of an ethical, moral, democratic accountability forum. And the fact that for the last 20 years or so, or during the last 20 years or so, there have kind of surfaced several so-called Bengali language satellite channels that are delivered through the Sky News mainly or similar. The fact that there have been these kind of channels, that fact alone or of its own does not, I repeat, does not deliver the information, the advice that the community has needed and still does need. Because there is no forum that actually works to educate and guide the community. Although the Bangladeshi community come from Bangladesh, from Silot, they are not here in Britain as representatives of Bangladesh as such. They are here and they came here mainly to alter, to change for the better the economic and social position. They did not represent, and they do not represent, and they cannot represent in the UK the political priorities of the particular political party or parties that they may know or may be connected with in terms of ideas, in terms of affiliation, in terms of the mental affiliation. They are Bangladeshis in terms of the description of their background, but the loyalty, the actual loyalty has to be to the community in here, day to day. This distinction is not being made by anybody and has never been made by anybody other than the movement that I represent and the campaigns that I represent. One of the main reasons why the so-called Bengali media has failed to identify the Bangladeshis' needs in the UK is because the media is a bogus outfit. It's not the spontaneous establishment of a media or medium, in the case of each one, that is founded on the clear purpose that needs to be met by a successful settlement in the community of a Bangladeshi backgrounded group of people or families, individuals, etc. And this leads to the lack of solidarity. Lack of solidarity in the objective sense, not in a partisan sense, not in an exclusive sense, but in an objective sense, ethically, morally, and on compassionate grounds, be dedicated to solidarize with one another so that they have the opportunity and the support and the foundation to achieve the best aims objectively defined in life in this community in the UK. So although there are these outlets, so-called media, none of them, and I say none of them repeatedly, has ever articulated what I am in short articulating in this broadcast and what I have been articulating and advocating in my statements, my written and vocal kind of representations that I've been making for decades. So there is a limbo, there is an emptiness there is a defining gap in the Bangladeshi community where bogus media outlets are operating without having the slightest understanding of the purpose for their existence in terms of the benefits or the service that the community at large deserves to be provided by them. So the media outlets, especially the ones that are carried by the satellites, are operated by seriously disturbed individuals who constantly misinterpret the community, misinform the community, because their loyalty is with people and forces based in Bangladesh. Now, Bangladesh has never been cited internationally as a source of model governance. So there is nothing that could be actually imported about good governance from Bangladesh to be implemented in the UK or in Tower Hamlets, for example, to begin with. And yet, the main so-called content, political content, the political bias represented by these outlets is the sterile, backward, obsolete, and corrupt mode of operation that is dominant in the corruptly operated institutions right across Bangladesh. So there is a conflict. Whenever we point this out to the public about the behavior of these corrupt, bogus outlets, these bogus and corrupt outlets react predictably. And they look for excuses to discredit our critique. What they're doing is they're actually taking part in kind of justifiable organized criminality of misleading the Bangladeshi community made up of the young persons mainly born and brought up in the UK. And this conflict between the observers of the corrupt role and behavior and the priority of the bogus Bangladeshi community outlets, this conflict is itself hidden and denied because there is not a third party, impartial third party, observing this conflict between ourselves on the one hand and the rest of the criminals operating these bogus outlets on the other. And we are having to continue to point this out, while we are also continuing to diagnose the corruption of the local council, the corruption in the behavior of the representatives, so-called in the name of this borough to the UK Parliament. And as you said in the previous edition about the representative in the name of the Tower Hamlets and East of London to the Greater London Assembly. We don't communicate with the Greater London Assembly representative, or we don't focus too much on the behavior of the Greater London Assembly person. Because in comparison with their kind of part in the same kind of lying and denial and corruption done by Tower Hamlets Council and the in this context by the Spitalfields Housing Cooperative and by the Spitalfields Small Business Association. Compared to the wrongdoings of these organizations, historically and where appropriate currently, the role of the actual kind of bogus media has been insignificant when it comes to positively identifying the strength of the community. And they have been found to be unable to explain this society to the audience, and they have not been able to explain the audience or the community to this society.